Hello and welcome back to the IPA's Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. It's another packed show today as we unpack the closure of Holden in Australia by General Motors, the continuing reverberations of the High Court decision, and we also look at what's coming out of the United Kingdom in respect of the BBC. Is it also something we can do in Australia with the ABC? Don't forget, Looking Forward is a production of the Institute of Public Affairs. If you're not already a member, please do go to ipa.org.au to see how you can join or donate. As always, we'll close with our Books and Culture segment, and today we look at, well, of course, a comedy about Hitler. What else do we have? We have a Burt Lancaster classic from the golden age of Hollywood, right up to date there, Andrew. A new podcast from Eric Weinstein, and just to mix it up, I'll talk about an actual book, which is on the East India Company, and that's by the great William Dalrymple. It's time now to introduce our panellists. First of all, my co-host from RMIT University, Dr. Chris Berg.
Good morning, Scott.
Good morning, Chris. Welcoming back our very regular panellist, Dr. Andrew Bushnell. Oh, not Doctor yet, sorry.
No. Let's not be too presumptuous.
Not everybody passes their PhDs.
Whoops,
Andrew. I don't know whether you know this.
Got a bit ahead of myself there.
The pressure on a little bit more.
I did that to Aaron Lane once, and we had to cut. He was very sensitive because he was actually waiting on his thesis to be approved.
Yeah, it's actually a bit unethical, or not unethical, but it's unprofessional to call yourself a doctor before they've given you the proper stamp.
Very good. And another lawyer, but also the IPA's newest researcher. Welcome to the panel, Dara Macdonald.
Great to be here.
Great to have you. So we're going to kick off, as I said, with Holden, which is the Australian subsidiary of General Motors, and I should start with, I guess, an emotional note, which is Holden as a brand. It's a tribute to marketing or to something, but it means a lot to a lot of Australians. It's part of their heritage, part of their history, particularly the older generations, the days of Ford versus Holden. We could spend a lot of time on the emotional aspects of it, but not for nothing are economists called exasperating calculators. Chris Berg, tell us what this really means.
I like exasperating. Whether I'm a calculator is a separate question. So the Holden brand has been axed 3 years after General Motors ceased producing Holden cars in Australia. This, of course, has had a number of ramifications. Holden, like the other Australian car manufacturers, was a beneficiary of really a century's worth of protectionism, all the way back to the First World War, when the government started putting tariffs on motor bodies. Holden itself is an Australian icon, in part, or mainly because of political decisions made by the government, particularly the Chifley government, to support Holden as an Australian icon. There's the political ramifications of this are quite interesting. So when General Motors made this decision, they only gave the Commonwealth government something like 15 minutes warning, and Scott Morrison came out and said he was very, very angry about the decision to shut down the Holden brand, and this is to quote the Prime Minister, like I think many Australians would be. Australian taxpayers put millions of dollars into this multinational company, yet they let the brand just wither away on their watch and are leaving it behind. I think it's very disappointing. I think at the end of the day, shows throwing all that taxpayer money at them, they were never going to respect that. Now, free market economists like myself, like the Institute of Public Affairs, have argued for a long, long time, well, precisely. That's precisely why you don't fund these sorts of companies. But it is absolutely the case, Scott, as you point out, that it is an iconic brand, and it's actually a very important moment probably in the history of industry policy in Australia. I might throw to you first, Andrew. What's your takeaway of this? Well, it's a symbolic moment, but it's an important one, I think.
Yeah, well, the first thing is, Scott Morrison's response, I think, is politicians are never quite as pathetic as when they're outraged in a futile way. So here he is, I'm outraged, we gave them $2 billion in subsidies and things like that, right? And there's absolutely no intention on his part or anyone else's part in the parliament to do anything about this, right? So why he has to say it, I guess, but outrage. And I just don't.
It's a lot
buy
like
it.
just to interrupt you, it's a lot like when the Treasurer traditionally yells at the banks for not passing on the interest rate. Like, they're not going to change the law to require them to pass on the interest rate, and that would be terrible.
Exactly.
You just got to scream for a while.
So I think it was Bob Catter that came out and said, well, we should just basically expropriate their IP and nationalise the brand.
Yeah,
Now,
I think he actually said it should be mandatory that all cars have to be Australian.
Yeah.
Australians would not be allowed to buy any car not built in Australia.
Now, a word in defence of Bob Catter
good one, Bob.
is that at least that is taking seriously the idea that the Parliament might do something, right? Scott Morrison's just out there blathering away, but I think to go to Scott's point about being sentimental, I don't have any particular sentimentality about cars, and I always thought when I was younger that it was a bit silly to be sentimental about brands, but when you think about the demise of the car manufacturing industry in Australia, and you compare it to today's reality, which is that basically everyone has the choice of barista school or homelessness, you do have, I think, there a legitimate cause for a moment of reflection about whether, the economic reality of this catching up to General Motors is something to be celebrated, because I think that what's symbolic here is the transition of Australia away from a country that perhaps ever really thought of itself as a nation towards basically a big Singapore.
Well, I think there was never any... there was always a bipartisan idea, or who doesn't have an idea that wouldn't it be nice if we had a manufacturing capability in Australia? But the road that we went down, as Chris said, 100 years ago, was tariffs. And how did that work out?
Not very well. I think Holden was kind of, death by 1,000 cuts in terms of regulatory policy, but then at the same time it was a kind of a corporatist Frankenstein that they kept on, breathing life back into it with subsidies and so on. So, I don't have so much, it wasn't so much of a shock in a way because it's kind of been on life support for quite some time now. But yeah, as lots of the panellists have mentioned, that it is very much an iconic brand, and certainly from growing up in country Australia, where it's very much the Holden or Ford family, or the people that are very much attached to not even wanting to drive or get into a Ford because it's such a it's such a cultural phenomenon in that respect. Yeah, so it's kind of like is a significant moment for Australia.
Yeah, and there's this kind of tail chasing aspect of it, I think, that Holden is very symbolic of. So you have the underlying economic conditions regarding, the high wages, the cost of getting the materials for things, setting up factories, and all of these other things that go towards the cost of actually manufacturing something in Australia. And that was all taken off the table, and then the subsidies and things were the way of basically chasing that tail. So they'd made this decision about the structure of the economy and then had to basically try and correct it in this specific case. And so again, this comes back to, governments basically, talk a lot about this. So, like you say, Scott, wouldn't it be great to manufacture cars? But the hard work to have a country that might manufacture cars, all of that was taken off the table in favour of cash handouts, which of course, General Motors is very happy to pocket, but to what end?
But the manufacture of cars is, it's a 1930s, 1940s version of, wouldn't it be great if Australia had a Silicon Valley as well? No, there's nothing inherent about either the car industry that leads to prosperity, nor Silicon Valley that leads to prosperity, nor anything inherent about the Australian population or the Australian landscape or the Australian industrial profile that says, well, Australia and cars, those are the two things that match together. And I think it's a stronger, of all the many, many problems that protectionism has, one of them is how it doesn't do what it says on the box, and it often holds back the manufacture or the production of whatever you want to artificially support rather than encourages it. And the thing that's quite striking, and having looked a little bit into the history of the car industry and its relationship to the car industry in the United States and Australia, is that we were far behind on significant innovations, at least particularly in those key decades in the 1930s, 1940s and 1950s. Our industry was about 10 years behind in getting some really key innovations like closed-top cars and full steel bodies and all that sort of thing. These are really critical things that meant that the US industry was so much further ahead of us. I think, though, Andrew, you've got a really good point about you can't separate the decision to subsidise manufacturing from the simultaneous decision to introduce things like the living wage or the working man's income, the high regulatory barriers that suffuse the entire economy.
Sorry.
I was just going to say that another aspect of manufacturing is that, this is a huge energy-intensive industry in terms of taking raw materials and producing something out of them. It takes a huge amount of energy to be able to produce those materials. And as we've seen with, the closing down of factories in South Australia, like lots of the high cost of energy is also a contributing factor to that.
That's a very good. That's a very good point. Yes, we triple energy costs and then wonder why manufacturing industry is closing down, and that's still happening with our a lot of residual industries which are more tied to resources such as chemicals and so on. And was also relevant to, I think, the much more consequential decision was back in 2014 when Toyota reached its crisis point. Toyota had taken over from Holden and Ford in terms of sales way back in 2000. One of the reasons, of course, why Holden is being closed is because sales are rubbish. I mean, the cars are rubbish. I mean, General Motors is rubbish. It was nationalised. It was owned by Barack Obama.
What they need is more taxpayer funding.
Yeah, that's right. So let's take a rubbish American company and give it more money. Thank you, Bob Catter. So more realistically, Toyota, which is an excellent car maker, did give Australia a really good go, and they invested mostly in Victoria, which means they didn't have so many South Australian friends, but mostly in Victoria, and they built new plants in Altona and then realised as soon as they started operating, they couldn't make any money out of them. And one of the things they tried to do, I've been going back through the story, was say, look, can we have a look at our EBA? Because this is not set up for productivity. And this is where you hit the classic thing of tariffs, which is, of course, tariffs are producing economic rents. And then it just becomes a game of who's going to claim the rents. And over time, the unions had claimed the rents. None of this helps consumers. And when Toyota actually said respectfully, in their very Japanese way, might you consider that we renegotiate this EBA? The AMWU went to the barricades. Joe Hockey, to his credit, was doing his bit of jawboning in Parliament, saying, as Treasurer, please have a look at this. This is make or break for Toyota. The union movement would not believe them. It would not countenance any change. They fought changes to the EBA in court. Lo and behold, what did Toyota do? They said, that's it. We're out of here. They had all $400 million plant on the books, which essentially they wrote off. So Holden is perhaps the most emotionally charged exit of the car makers, but I think the end of the industry was actually Toyota. And if I can just hog the microphone, Chris, you talked about comparative advantage. In effect, the one thing that Australia might be good at in terms of cars, given big distances, shit roads, very hot, all sorts of things. Maybe we could do utes. And lo and behold, what does Ford do? It has the Ford Ranger, which is a global brand designed in Australia. A little bit of comparative advantage actually sneaks through somewhere.
Yeah, that's right. And I also want to make you've brought up Joe Hockey, and Joe Hockey has been wildly defamed over the last couple of days. A couple of newspaper covers that implied that he'd been yelling at Holden just to get out of the country if they don't like it here. Joe Hockey in 2013, when we were having these discussions about whether to continue the car subsidies or reduce them, not eliminate them, but reduce them, had been trying to get General Motors to commit to stay if they received the same level of tariffs or subsidies, I should say, as they had in the past. And General Motors was incredibly cagey because they were leaving anyway. They knew that it was uneconomic to produce here, regardless of how much taxpayer money we funneled them. But of course now the coalition government is being blamed because it should have supported the car industry more and more. It does strike me, Andrew, it does strike me that this comes in the midst of a conversation that's been happening in the United States around the role of industry policy, particularly on the conservative right. I noticed that the conservative economist, I think he is, Oren Cass, has set up a sort of post-free market conservative movement that he's quite a notable advocate of conservative industry policy. How do you see this tying into that conversation?
Yeah, there's sort of two aspects to this that I'll bring up. The first is an aspect that used to be talked about a lot in Australia but is not so much anymore, which is that there is a national security, national identity aspect to domestic heavy manufacturing that sets it apart from, say, Silicon Valley, which is that there's a very long lead time towards manufacturing sophisticated military hardware, and that you need to have some sort of domestic manufacturing capability so that it can be converted in times of crisis.
But I've never understood that. So I remember the Labor Party in 2007 saying this quite explicitly, like, we're never going to be able to build fighter jets if we can't build cars. Now, the idea that you can convert a car factory to a fighter jet factory seems to me, in any time frame, seems ludicrous.
Yeah, well,
knock it down.
Look, it's not obviously a one-to-one substitution, but I think the argument usually is that there is some sort of reserve capacity of knowledge, engineering knowledge, and as well as the supply chains, so the materials that go into these things are often the same. So I think, so that aspect of it is that for a nation to be able to declare itself a nation, it needs to be able to defend its territory, and part of that is having access to the materials that are required for that defence. So that's one aspect that doesn't get talked about a lot in Australia anymore, which means that essentially our strategic reserve for military goods is the market, the international market. The other
closest
ally. Sorry, I'm just hold that second thought, please, because I am going to interrupt. That's the story that's told. You're right, that's the story that's told. They are finding in Adelaide where that story was told, which is one of the ways Christopher Pyne justified, the submarine decision, which is going to cost us like over $200 billion. It's like, all those workers that came out of the car industry can now go and work on submarines. With the greatest respect to those workers who are hard-working, they'd got all their trade qualifications, they'd done everything they needed to do to work in the Australian car industry, such as it is. When they apply for jobs with the French are like, wow, this is so far off what you need to produce something as complex as a submarine. And we can talk about retraining and all of these things, but there is a chasm between the sort of capability. So these are not fungible things, but so
fungibility is an interesting concept in this debate, because ultimately this strategic element of heavy manufacturing, this argument that's traditionally been made, comes down to a very basic critique of comparative advantage and the substitution of value, which is that when push comes to shove, it is better to be the tank-producing, helicopter-producing country than the wine-producing agricultural country. And this is just a basic fact of international relations. So that's that one aspect. The other aspect that I would bring up, just that I think is an element of this debate, particularly in the United States, is about different kinds of work being valuable in different ways to different people. And in particular, heavy manufacturing, the use of manpower, the idea that at the end of the day, a team of men will have produced something tangible, and that having a sort of a more beneficial psychological effect than, say, God bless them, but selling tailored suits or whatever it is that we're all supposed to do now. There is an aspect of this that is based on a denial of, well, arguably anyway, basic male psychology about what it is that makes men in particular happy, and that the rising anomie, the alienation that we see in our modern society, despite the surfeit of goods that we have, comes down to a lack of meaning, but a lack of meaning that you derive specifically from being engaged in a team effort towards a tangible result.
Dara, how would you respond to that?
I think there is some value in that argument of, that work in its essence has changed a lot from tangible manufacturing of goods to more of a services-based industry. I think it kind of echoes, there was this clip of Bloomberg over the past few days talking about farmers in a very kind of paternalistic way of saying, anyone can dig a hole and, put a seed in and let it grow, but it takes a particular type of person to, produce a technological good in Silicon Valley, for instance. And I think it was very paternalistically put, but at the same time there is a argument to be had there that not necessarily just because jobs are cropping up in this sector and jobs are going in this sector that you can move these jobs from there to there. There has to be something for these people to do. What that is the question, I think, which is most plaguing our societies at the moment, in terms of what to do with the loss of jobs, and particularly in the manufacturing and the heavy manufacturing type of sector. And this is kind of why we've seen candidates like Andrew Yang crop up, and with the sole policy of basically a UBI to help with the automation of particular jobs. And
basically palliate people.
Yeah, palliate people, exactly.
I want to take up something, and this is a half-formed thought, but the idea that...
This is looking forward. This is the place to do it, mate.
Yeah. So
half-formed thoughts are our speciality.
Why not record your half-formed thoughts and send them out to listeners around the country? So it strikes me that if you follow the first argument that you made, Andrew, about the relationship between domestic capabilities and national security, the idea that Silicon Valley versus, say, a manufacturing industry is wildly out of date, given the discussions that we're having right now about A, cybersecurity, B, should Huawei be able to build infrastructure in Australia, the UK, or the United States, each of which have different perspectives on this, obviously. But it seems to me that the frontiers of our national security debates and strategic position are actually in those technological ones. So yeah, they may not be getting what you've posited to be the sort of masculine benefits or the building stuff with your hands benefits. But if we were to follow that argument much more closely, and if we would take it really seriously, we would be not subsidising cars, but we would be subsidising coders, and we would be subsidising Telstra.
Well, we do that as well.
No, we absolutely do. But that doesn't seem to be where this debate about industry policy is.
Well,
and I don't. Yeah. Why is it not?
Well, it's absolutely true that there is sort of this new frontier, new battlefront, if you like. But the argument is that the residual, sort of the underlying fact of the matter is that physical force wins the day. There was it's a few years ago now, it'd be about 10 years, there was a notorious war game in the United States where they mocked up an invasion of the southern United States. And basically the invading force...
turned off their phones.
Ran all their messages by courier, and were basically able to get an end run around their high-tech opponents. And this was look, it's a little bit overstated, of course, because direct attacks on the electronic capabilities of various military hardware will shut them down.
As we do to Iran all the time.
I think just to preempt maybe the culture segment, I think a very good movie about this point. No, this is. Yep. Let me do this.
No, go ahead.
2 minutes, but whatever.
Red Dawn, bunch of school kids fight off the Russians?
No. So a movie that was overlooked at the time because the actual mechanics of the plot are a little bit stupid, but it's called Black Hat. It's by Michael Mann, has Chris Hemsworth in the lead role. It's about this hacker who gets gets taken out of prison by the CIA to do this thing. But anyway, the point of that movie is he ends up, so you've got these hackers, it's one of those movies about hackers and everyone's typing on computers and that. But in the end, basically...
Just always makes great content.
In the
just
end,
people typing.
It comes down to an act of actual physical violence.
Yep.
The movie is resolved. And the point of the movie is, and it's made throughout the movie, that for all of this sort of digital wizardry, it's actually all of the analog steps that this guy takes,
the requirement,
including stabbing the guy at the end.
But that's the requirement for Hollywood. And the best hacking movie is Sneakers. And in Sneakers, it's all about cryptography and digital disputes and whatnot. But eventually, they just have to sneak in somewhere. But we need to do that so we can watch it. Anyway, this was just an opportunity for me to mention Sneakers on the podcast. So we should probably move on to the next topic.
I was going to say that was our books and culture segment. No, but we do need to revisit. We spoke about the High Court decision last week, but it is still rumbling through the Australian body politics. So Chris and I decided it was worth revisiting.
Yeah, so when the High Court decision came through, it came through the day before we recorded.
Love and Tom's, the High Court decision about if you had Aboriginal Australian identity and yet were not a citizen, should you be considered to be an alien under the Constitution or a citizen or something else, which the High Court, some justices have decided is a belonger. The reason that we thought it was a good idea to revisit is the fallout has been really substantial. We read in the paper lots of new arguments and lots of new concerns, lots of new arguments by advocates as well, I should say, in defence of this case, but particularly how it interacts with our ongoing debates about the voice to Parliament, constitutional recognition, and so forth. And of course, we have the opportunity to talk to Andrew and Dara about it. I know both of you have been looking at these decision and its implication very closely. Andrew, I might throw to you. I've got have law degrees,
and you have law degrees, which helps.
A long time ago.
I've got a lot of questions to ask both of you, in fact, but I just thought we'd throw Andrew and then Dara. What was your takeaway from this decision, or how do you think it's played out over the last week or so?
Yeah, I think we're only just starting to see now, as you say, some commentary pieces come out. It's taken a week for everyone to digest it because there were 7 separate judgments. It's about 500 paragraphs long, the various judgments. So it's taken a while. I think, and to be honest, I'm still forming my own views about exactly what it means. But the top level message to take away from this, I think, is that the High Court has decided to read into the Constitution Indigenous identity as separate from. Now, or separate might not be the right word, but as a specific subset of what it means to be Australian. So for most of us, our Australianness is determined by our citizenship. The High Court has decided that because some people's descent predates the Constitution and more specifically the reception of the common law to Australia, that their Australianness has a different aspect to us. Now, this is a somewhat radical departure from how we have understood Australianness.
But Australianness isn't in the Constitution. Citizenship is.
No, citizenship, and this is the thing about the modern nation state, is that the nation state sort of emerges from the idea that a particular people have a state that controls a particular territory, and there's membership of that group. But when you control this territory and you want to admit people to your territory, and there's all kinds of good reasons why you want to have people coming and going from your territory, we've formalised membership as citizenship, and there's actually a disjunction that exists in all modern nation states between membership of the sort of foundational group and citizenship. So in that sense, the decision mirrors that. But what it says is that within the Australian nation state, membership of a very specific group is different from membership of that larger group in whose name the Commonwealth exists. And I think the implications of that may well be far-reaching in further decisions as they transfer this logic to other aspects of the Constitution. But that, of course, remains to be seen. They've all said well, not all of them, but the majority has hinted that they think that this is not a reversal of Mabo. Mabo says that Indigenous land rights can be recognised without any impact on the sovereignty of the Commonwealth, more specifically the Queen of Australia. And the majority says that they're not weakening that, but it remains to be seen how future courts in future cases will expand this phenomenon.
Dara.
Yeah, I would echo that in the sense that this decision leaves a lot to be desired, in the sense that it leaves more questions than it answers in many respects. The kind of the concept of citizenship is a legal concept, as opposed to what, and the Chief Justice was very explicit in her judgment and going through actually what the legal position is, and that it's not necessarily for the court, and it's definitely not for the court, as she decided, to make these, metaphysical decisions about belonging and what constitutes a special connection to the land. Instead, we have a very clear precedent and statute law that gives that power to the parliament, the parliamentary sovereignty, to decide, who is a citizen and who is not a citizen. So it begs the question of, okay, so if citizenship of Australia is, a parcel of rights and responsibilities, or rights and obligations that are conferred on someone that, it has a citizenship of Australia, what then does the third category mean? What are the reciprocal rights and responsibilities that flow from having a third category? And the other aspect of this is that particularly the majority judgments are not based on precedent per se. They had to go, to the far off corners of the land and commentaries on the laws of England and various colonial extracts to be able to find, magic up this kind of judgment, basically. And so, there's a lot to be desired, in the sense that it leaves so many more questions than it answers, and what the flow-on effects from this is what will remain to be seen, really.
I have a constitutional question, or a constitutional interpretation question. So there are 7 separate judgments, 3 to 4. Is it and George Williams, the legal scholar George Williams, has a piece today about the judgment, where he points out that the fact, it is a problem, or it is remarkable, I should say, from his perspective. But it seems to me to be a problem that there are 7 separate judgments that the judges could not come to a consensus of some description about this. So it strikes me that obviously creates a problem for lower courts, because they've got to interpret certainly 4 separate judgments in the majority, and then potentially 3 other issues. Is it a problem? Does this say something about the High Court's functioning? Does this say something about this particular case?
I think it can be that in very important cases, every judge wants to put his or her opinion.
But that's
on
indulgent,
the record.
Isn't it? I mean, but it's not their job. I mean, you can write an op-ed if you want.
But to defend them just a little, and I actually incline probably more towards your view that they actually have a responsibility to try and unify the law somewhat. But to defend them somewhat, in the grand sort of evolutionary tradition of the common law, basically you put out these judgments and the strongest one survives. And this is what we saw. Back at law school, it used to, and since then I've always hated the High Court, because our Australian High Court always issues separate judgments, almost as a matter of course. And so for a long time, for example, Australian negligence law had 2 competing strands that you had to learn both in law school. And when it came to your exam, you basically had to apply twice the law, which is bizarre. And so I incline more to your view. But in their defence, because this is quite a very novel, radical decision that they've taken, it might be for the best that the 4 majority judges have each stated their reasoning, and we'll see whether that lives or dies, particularly when read next to the Chief Justice's, what I would say, extremely clear and precise and admirably economical dissent, which basically just says, here's the precedent for how we interpret aliens, the alien power and what the Parliament can do with it. applied to this case, it means this result, that's it.
Yeah, I would agree with that as the 1 + 1 = 2 kind of judgment. Like you look at the Chief Justice's judgment and it's this big, and you look at Alderman's, which is the very egregious one, and it's like, this big basically in terms of...
For anyone listening on the podcast, Dara's fingers went further apart.
Yeah, tiny amount of paper for the Chief Justice and a lot of paper for the egregious Edelman judgment.
Visual gags, much less effective on podcasts.
Yes, this is true.
I have something I wanted to throw in. So Edelman's judgment, by far the thickest, and we have got into metaphysics, but that was the word he used. And one of the other things that he did, which annoyed me when I read it, was the Commonwealth Solicitor General had led a line of argument that if you go down this road of saying that we are unable to deport these this new category of non-alien non-citizens, because it must have been countenanced in discussion, the Solicitor General said, well, but then some 60-year-old who's trying to get back to Australia, notwithstanding a criminal offence, could just say I'm Aboriginal and try and get back into the country. And Edelman went out of his way to ridicule this as being a low form of argument, quoted precedent to the extent that this is the type of argument which the High Court should never countenance because it's like a low form of reductio ad absurdum. Thank God for popular culture. Followers of AFL will be aware that Dustin Martin, perhaps the finest player of this generation, Brownlow medalist, Norm Smith medalist, premiership player with Richmond, has a father in New Zealand who is a former member of the Rebels Motorcycle Club, or current member for all I know, has been unable to return to Australia after 20 years in New Zealand because of the very same powers that were used to decide in the case of Love v Toms. So what happens? So here we are. This case, which we think is consequential, is not getting much coverage in the popular press. But Dustin Martin's father arrived at the airport in Australia and said, you can't deport me because I am Indigenous. So exactly the scenario that the Solicitor General had said could happen as a result of this decision did happen. Now, as it happens, they just put him back on a plane and said, well, you're welcome to apply to a court. But, I mean, this is where we are. And maybe it's these kinds of things which will actually broaden the pool of Australians who are actually aware of this decision and what it potentially means.
It should also be said, just as a caveat to that it's not enough just to say, I'm Indigenous, therefore. There's a 3-part test that you've got to be recognised as Indigenous and you've got to have Indigenous heritage, but it's absolutely right. I do want to just touch on one other part of this, and this is something that has been talked about a lot in conservative and free market circles in the last week or so. It's what does this mean for the High Court in general? So Christian Porter, when the decision came out, the Attorney General Christian Porter made the point that he was investigating whether it was still going to be possible through another means to deport these 2 men. Now, I don't overly care whether these 2 men are deported. I'm much more interested in finding out what does this mean for constitutional interpretation in general. Janet Albrechtsen, of course, the chairperson, chairman of the IPA, has pointed out that 2 of the judges involved in the majority, I think it is, are up for... will retire in the next year or so, and this gives an opportunity for the government to appoint new judges. There's an article in Lawyers Weekly responding to some claims made by the IPA's Morgan Begg that this court case should not be used as a reason to politicise the High Court. Andrew, Dara, should we politicise the High Court? This beautiful, unpolitical...
Exactly. The High Court is already political, and
no, it's law.
And even if we didn't describe it as political, I think it is a pretty gross distortion of the rule of law to suggest that we can't criticise the policy outcomes from legal decisions. That's not what the separation of powers means.
I've read otherwise actually in recent days.
It's not just the court says it, therefore. It's as it has happened with Mabo, there were. Separate judgments, the law was unclear. The Keating government decided it had to legislate to make the system clearer. So it's not like the Parliament just has to do nothing. Now, as to the political makeup of the court, there has been a reluctance in Australia on the centre right to really engage with the court appointment process. In Australia, we don't have big hearings. We don't have an up or down vote in the Senate. The Attorney General can basically pick whoever he likes. And in this case, what this case has done is really focus our attention a little bit on, do we have, on our side of politics, a clear statement of what we think a good lawyer actually looks like, someone that we think we could trust to have these powers and do this job. So we need to be clear about that. And then there is definitely an aspect about putting the onus on the Attorney General in a supposedly conservative government to do the right thing. 3 of the 4 in the majority were appointed by coalition governments. 2 were appointed by Tony Abbott, who is probably the most conservative Prime Minister we've had, certainly probably more conservative even than Howard. So how is it that we end up with the recommendations that get put on the Attorney General's desk leading to outcomes like this that seem to have upset so many of the government's own supporters? And I think those are the 2 questions. What's a good lawyer, and how do we get good lawyers' names in front of the Attorney General?
Dara, is there a Australian version of... So Morgan Berg, when he was on the podcast last, was talking to us about the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society is notable not just for nominating a list of judges that they think, a list of potential judges that they think should be appointed, and of course the Trump administration has picked those up, but also building a idea what conservative legal theory actually is, the originalist interpretation of the Constitution. Is there an Australian version of that? Is there?
Unfortunately, not so much. We haven't, focused on that in the recent past, and we see on the Lawyers Weekly article that it was particularly attacking the idea of a capital C conservative judge. But in this instance, what we're talking about when we say capital C conservative is actually a black letter lawyer, what used to be called a black letter lawyer. That's someone that actually views their job as interpreting the law instead of, this kind of activist streak that we've seen in the High Court recently. There's not really a body of work here that we can draw upon so much as in the US, where they have the Federalist Society that is not just putting together a list, which is based on criteria, but it's also going back and looking at it in a philosophical sense of what, and particularly talking about the idea of originalism, of interpreting the Constitution as it was written, as opposed to looking at other schools of thought around constitutional interpretation and contextualising it for the modern times, etc., etc.
And you were saying that the task of doing that in Australia might be a little bit harder than in the US because of the nature of our legal system. And
so we don't have a test case. For instance, that in the US they're entitled to interpret the Constitution all the way down in lower courts. But in Australia, the exclusive jurisdiction to the Constitution exists at the High Court, so we don't have test cases. Particularly, this is interesting if you're looking at Section 51 of the Constitution, which is the head of powers. And this is the idea that the federal government is exclusively entitled to these particular powers, and anything that isn't in there are called residual powers, and that's the right of the states to exercise. And in recent years, we've seen more and more the centralisation of the government into the federal government, precisely because these powers have been interpreted particularly broadly. And in combination with the Section 109, which is the inconsistencies clause, that anything that is inconsistent between federal and state law, the federal law prevails. So this has also been interpreted broadly. So these 2 clauses, in terms of which actually affect the nature of the federalised system of Australia, have no test cases in the lower courts. We can't actually...
So you can't read a judgment by someone in the Supreme Court of South Australia or wherever.
Yeah, and know what they think about the federalised system.
Because they can only apply it.
Yeah.
And that's one of the ironies that comes through in this judgment for people on the centre right. And this goes to this question of what's a good lawyer. One of the ironies is that this judgment is actually very much outside of the normal MO of the High Court. The High Court normally reads the power of the Commonwealth Parliament expansively. And so the one time that the High Court in living memory steps in to limit the power of the Parliament.
Oh, but they can't do that.
Yeah, it's on this. And I think that gives you an idea of how radical the majority judgments are, in that, I mean, certainly Edelman basically has to junk the entire line of precedent around the interpretation of the alien's power. So when we ask ourselves, well, okay, if not these people, then who? Who would you like to have on the court? One of the key questions is which powers should be read expansely and which ones should not, because it seems that the High Court perhaps has it around the wrong way.
Now, Edelman, because he was appointed when he was so young, I think has 24 years left on the High Court. So I guess the good news for looking forward is we won't be short of material for the next 24 years. I look forward to discussing this in
that is great news.
2040. But in the meantime, we do need a little bit of time, which is probably to organise a gratuitous plug for this book, Against Public Broadcasting, by Chris Berg and Sinclair Davidson, because there is some noise out of the UK that Boris Johnson and his advisor Dominic Cumming actually want to do something about the BBC.
There is, and sometimes from the Australian vantage, given how much the ABC looks to the BBC culturally, organisationally, it's sometimes striking how strange the BBC's financial setup is. So there's a proposal out of the UK, potentially from Boris Johnson's office or potentially just Dominic Cummings running his mouth, to move away from the licence fee model that funds the BBC to a subscription model. So the subscription model would be something along a Netflix situation. How that matches to free-to-air television, I'm not sure that they've totally decided. But the key thing is that they still have a licence fee. So in the UK, you pay as a TV, if you're interested in watching free-to-air TV or the BBC's online offerings, you have to buy a licence for £154 a year, 154 pounds and per year for a colour licence, and if you only want a black and white licence, you can buy that at £52 a year. Now, the question might be, what if I don't want to pay that? Well, it's against the law. You have to pay it if you want to watch the television. How do they know if I'm watching television? What a great question. I'm glad you asked. They don't really know. There's been all sorts of histories of pretending that they can figure out all sorts of things. But nonetheless, technically, you have to buy the licence fee. It dates back to a very, very past era when we didn't have the technology to actually charge people for the use of television broadcasters. In Australia, we had this as well. So the ABC was originally funded through a licence fee arrangement. We got rid of that in 1948 when the ABC came to the Chifley government, asked for a licence fee increase, and instead of nationalising the entire broadcasting sector, the Chifley government decided to just pay the ABC out of general revenue. I think it's iconic. I think it's indicative that this proposal of number 10 is very unlikely to go anywhere, given the response that it's had and given the role of the BBC in the public mind. But Dara, I might throw to you first. What's your take on this, trying to get rid of this bizarre anachronism?
Well, I just wanted to add to your comment of that it's against the law and it's a strict liability offence as well. It doesn't matter why you didn't pay your licence fee. It doesn't matter that you couldn't afford a loaf of bread. If you get hauled over to court, you have to pay a $1,000 fine at least. Yeah. So it's not at all. If anyone was going to argue that this is a poll tax, I think they have a particular a leg to stand on there. And the other aspect is that they have the goons that go around and they count how many televisions you have in your home, and if it looks like it's plugged in, then okay, yes, you have to pay the tax. It is completely anachronistic, but in this instance, it actually has worked out better because this actually can trigger an argument that this should be a subscription model as opposed to a forced model, and actually have a humanitarian leg to stand on in a sense, particularly if you look at it from a legal point of view, that this is a strict liability offence. Yeah, so I think that this is a very interesting conversation, and I don't know how we can pick it up into the Australian context where, the $1 billion that we send to the ABC is siphoned off in our taxes, and we don't necessarily notice it coming out of our pocket in the same way. But yeah, so it's a very interesting debate, particularly also when you take into the cultural aspect of the BBC, and that it gets as much ire around bias and this sort of aspect as well, compared to...
What is actually the argument, though, that Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings are running for this? Because there's a number of different arguments you might take. So for Chris, it's redundancy would be the argument. Yeah. One would be political bias. One would be the cost, that people shouldn't have to pay it if they don't want to, if they don't use it. Because the reason I ask that question is because the Conservative Party recently expanded its majority largely by taking seats off Labor in working class areas who are accustomed really to having the BBC. They're probably more likely to support the retention of the BBC. And I'm wondering how this fits with how the Conservative government actually won the last election, and whether they've taken seriously the reasons why they won.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, and I think we've discussed, I can't remember whether you were on the podcast when we discussed this, the simultaneous fact that Boris Johnson has taken a lot of left-wing seats and has tacked very hard left. Those are two truths, and I can't help but think that they're deeply connected. And I think Johnson also sees and the shutting down of the last 24 hours of this proposal, or at least the stepping back from this proposal by Boris Johnson personally, seems to suggest that he has exactly the same
I don't think
calculation
the
in mind.
redundancy argument probably applies as much to the BBC. Whereas here in Australia,
in what sense?
In that, basically because it has such a suite of platforms that people are very accustomed to using. It's actually, for a lot of British people, it's sort of their first port of call. That the disruption of getting rid of the BBC would be greater. It takes up a larger part of their market, their TV and stream, all the platforms that they have, the radio and everything. Whereas here in Australia, I mean, I would start smaller than you, Chris. I would start with the SBS, which is completely, almost extraordinarily redundant. It doesn't even do what it used to say it did. As someone who,
so we thought, sorry to interrupt, we thought about putting the SBS in the book, but we thought it was too obviously boring to do, because it's obviously unnecessary, and the case for merging it with the ABC...
unnecessary to be funded by taxpayers.
Yeah, sorry. The case for merging with the ABC is probably the easiest public policy decision any government could make in any Australian context, but it has not happened.
Yeah, because you can get any foreign programs you want. I mean, and I know this because my wife who is Peruvian, we watch a lot of Spanish language material on Netflix and indeed YouTube. I mean, Melissa has not missed one episode of her favourite shows from Peru, and this has nothing to do with SBS. Nothing to do with SBS.
Completely redundant. Yes, and also this is not a well-developed argument, but let's face it, the ABC is not even in the same ballpark as the BBC in terms of the degree of difficulties of unpacking the BBC. I mean, the ABC, it's the best argument against the ABC at the moment is most of what actually they broadcast.
Yeah, no, we were
sounds
having
like
this
a
conversation.
gratuitous slide, but there's a fact-free zone.
We were having this conversation before,
generally
and
terrible.
why is the BBC so popular? And part of it is not because of the news broadcasting all that. It's because of the TV shows that it puts on are like quite good or well loved, and there's a genre that they have in the UK that the ABC does not produce, but is such an important genre to the BBC, and that's the surprisingly high murder rate in the Village shows, where it's just the detective just finds the next person's been killed, the next person's been killed. People love that. Now, why is the ABC either uninterested or constitutionally unable to produce that sort of content? The answer to that puzzle is a big reason why it would be a hell of a lot easier.
Yeah, if I were the minister, I would just direct. I wouldn't actually get rid of the ABC. I would just direct them to create and screen pro-Australian propaganda all the time.
But I mean,
That's
murder rate in the village is not pro-British propaganda.
No, it's pro-rural depopulation.
And the discussion we
It's
had,
an argument for urbanisation.
but
It is not safe in the village.
But the discussion we were having, Andrew, is they can't do it because the ABC can't produce anything about Australia without irony.
Yeah,
They can do
it's a good way
broad
of
brush
putting it,
stuff
yeah.
like Kath and Kim, which is brilliant, absolute piss take. But even when they try to do it seriously, they can't.
Yeah.
I mean, they said a show in Tasmania, but it's ironic. It's taking the piss. They just can't help themselves because they're alienated inner urban intellectuals, aren't they, Andrew?
Well, absolutely.
Speaking of books and culture, ABC's about culture. We have come to that part of the program where we discuss what we've been reading, watching and listening to. And shall we start off with Jojo Rabbit?
Yeah, so I watched finally Jojo Rabbit. I missed it in the cinema. Jojo Rabbit, the new movie directed by Taika Waititi. Many listeners will know that it won the Best Adapted Screenplay Oscar. It's based on a novel. It stars Waititi himself, Scarlett Johansson with a child actor who's who it's their first movie, and it's also got smaller parts by Sam Rockwell and Rebel Wilson. For those who don't know, and I'm sure most listeners, I should say, do, it's about a young German boy who is a fanatical Nazi in the 1940s. I think it's set in 1944. I think I picked that up. Who has Adolf Hitler as his imaginary friend. Waititi himself plays Adolf Hitler, apparently because he couldn't find any other actors to play the comic version of Adolf Hitler. There's really two things. There's two fairly simple observations to make. This is a very, very well done addition to the genre of Nazi-themed comedies, of which there is a small but influential number. Life is Beautiful, of course, which I think won the Oscar. Andrew, I'm looking at you. Won an Oscar some years ago.
Roberto Benigni.
Yep, the Great Dictator, of course, the Charlie Chaplin movie, and The Producers. But Waititi himself is like a one-man New Zealand film renaissance. His films are uniformly incredible. He has managed to really do challenging films or simple films and make them more challenging or make them more interesting. And it's very much well worth watching. The other thing I've written down is, anybody seen the movie the other Nazi-themed comedy is Look Who's Back? Has anybody seen Look Who's Back?
Oh, yes, I did.
It's a 2015 German movie about what happens if Hitler just turns up one day. And
he wakes up just outside the bunker and like, oh, it's 2015.
Yeah, and the movie doesn't quite work, and there's it tries to have a bit of a cinema verite where they get real Germans to talk to this fake Hitler and say, oh yes, you did really well in the time, and so it's supposed to be an expose of how racist Germany still is. But anyway, that's all I really
there's the Producers, of course, is the other big one that makes fun of, and this is because the Nazis had such a unique sense of style, to put it one way, that they actually, they lend themselves to parody because it's just quite ridiculous.
It's the Hugo Boss suits.
Yeah, it's all the really sharp tailoring and the stylized like design. The whole aesthetic lends itself to a kind of parody, except for the extraordinarily terrible things that they did. I mean, it's a fine line to walk.
Is there something to say about comedy out of horror?
Yeah, I think, how do you find a way in to something as awful as the Holocaust? It's I was watching Spielberg the other day and what it took for him to get to make Schindler's List. And so what's that, late 80s?
No, 94.
94, okay. So, 50 years after...
The best year in movies.
Yeah, 50 years after the end of the war, to find a way to tell the story of Auschwitz. And until then, it had only been Mel Brooks who could talk about the Nazis and who these people were, because only comedy could find a way in. And maybe over time that's changed and we have some historical perspective. But popular culture, I think, is a good way.
Yeah, I think the caution is around not making World War II and Nazi Germany seem banal. like just another quirky occurrence in human history. So I think that's the fine line that people have to walk, is that because on one hand you want to laugh at these people for their ridiculous beliefs and things, but on the other hand you want to make sure that the consequences of it aren't downplayed. And I think if he's been able to do it, I haven't seen the movie, but if he's been able to do that, then that is quite some trick.
Traditionally, what they do, and the producers is not this example, but they start light and end dark. So that's the strategy that Life is Beautiful used. It starts light and ends quite dark and very sad and serious. And in fact, Jojo Rabbit is not just a comedy all the way through. It actually becomes quite affecting and quite powerful because it brings out those themes and it says interesting things.
And my kids went, so we should never forget. And if that gets 15-year-olds in cinemas knowing something about the Nazis as opposed to nothing, which is what you get at school, then it's a good thing.
Yep.
Dara.
Actually, I'm following on the theme a little bit, in the sense that my podcast recommendation is The Portal with Eric Weinstein, and he's the original coiner of this concept of the intellectual dark web. So the portal is the concept that we're stuck in this kind of humdrum kind of existence, and we need the way out. We need the way out of, all these different institutional complexes that we find ourselves in, whether it's academia or the mainstream media or whatever the case may be. The portal is kind of trying to find the heterodox view in this circumstance and getting the hell out of this, industrial complex of the university or whatever it might be. The first episode, though, is incredibly interesting because he interviews his boss, Peter Thiel, and they talk about the dichotomies in their relationship. The first being that
they're always the most honest interviews with your boss.
Yeah,
that's right.
He does come across as quite sycophantic, perhaps even in awe of Peter Thiel.
Yeah.
Well, Peter Thiel he's made a lot of money out of PayPal and Facebook and various Silicon Valley ventures, and he's worth a couple of billion. So yeah, I'd be sycophantic too.
Yeah, why not? Yeah, so he interviews him, and they talk about the dichotomies in their relationship. First being that he's a libertarian right-wing economics economist, and then also that he supported Trump, and then obviously Eric Weinstein is a bit to the left wing in terms of economics and so on. So they're talking about these dichotomies in their relationship, but also where they meet, in the sense that they also think that there's a stagnation problem in terms of technology, that if we went if you took someone from 1940 to here to the present day, they would be astounded. But if you took someone from 1980 to now, apart from the phones and the laptop and these sorts of things, is basically we're not driving around in you don't have jetpacks or
where's the flying cars?
Exactly.
I like Peter. Wild. Anyway.
I think we may agree for once on this. But perhaps for different reasons. But I think I like Peter Thiel, but when I was listening to this, it struck me that it's not so incredible that in a 50-year period the world might not have changed unrecognisably. If you went to any period in human history, that would be the norm, that things would persist for much longer than 50 years. And so I think there's this kind of, among sort of accelerationist types, if you like, there's this kind of longing for permanent revolution, and they're disappointed that the timeframes for development, because of physical time-bounded human beings being what they are, they get disappointed by that. And that's the part of his analysis where I'm like, so what, right? So what that a car is still a car? So what that a TV is still a TV? I mean,
at least we've got a taco that can actually stand up on a table.
But
there is progress.
That is true. I don't know who has hard tacos, but those are strange people. But no, I think that's the biggest change that has happened in hundreds of years, I would say, would be the massive communications revolution, which is hard to see but easy to feel, insofar as you can instantly at any time have any human answer to any question that you want. Now, that has incredible political consequences. because rightly or wrongly, people, we get lots of complex conspiracy theories. We get lots of interesting political movements from left and right and centre and from wherever. But that is an enormous change, and it's really easy for us to forget how radical a change it was. And I remember when I started at the IPA, I would ask people who'd been at the IPA for much longer than I.
I'm looking at the clock here, Chris.
Okay.
Is this going to be a long story?
No. I would ask them, how on earth would you do your research? And they would say, we would go to the library. And what do you mean you go to the library? Wasn't that incredibly time consuming? We get everything we want on the internet right now, and the social, political, economic consequences of that have not been fully recognised, let alone worked out.
Indeed. I just wanted to ask Dara, so that was the mission that Weinstein set himself in the first episode to find these portals. Have you been listening to other episodes? And is he getting any closer to it? Is he actually anywhere near that mission of finding the way out of the morass in which we find ourselves?
In a way, I mean, the second dichotomy that they explore is that he's Jewish ancestry and that he had, family that died in the Holocaust, and Peter Thiel is German, so they explore this dichotomy. So it expands on this throughout the episodes, and there's a few really good ones. One is with Bret Easton Ellis, the American Psycho guy, and they're talking about the darkness of the period of darkness in LA in the period of the 80s, basically. And that's an interesting kind of window into how the world has changed. And then the other one is with Julia Lindell, which is the granddaughter of an SS officer, which he invites into his house, basically, and stays with him. And they do a podcast exploring kind of how she's come to terms with her history in that respect. So there's a few very dark ones and a few very light ones. But yeah, they're very interesting conversations that kind of take you out of the normal paradigm of human conversation in this age.
Very good. Well worth a listen. I might jump in here with, just to mix it up, with a book. What I am holding up is William Dalrymple's The Anarchy. Dalrymple made a tour. He's famously an historian of India. He came to Australia a few months ago, and I went to see him talk, which I'm glad I did, because he basically summarised the whole book for me. It's taken me a while to plough through it, but this is a history of it's called The Anarchy: The Relentless Rise of the East India Company. And I must admit, I had never really thought about how astounding it was that, we know about the British Raj, Queen Victoria, Empress of India, blah, 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 blah. But of course, it was not the English government which ever set out to conquer India. Well, no one set out to conquer India. What they did, as they used to do, was set up a chartered corporation to issue shares, and it had the mission of trade with India. And, all European powers were doing this. The French were trading in India. But then we had this remarkable thing that this little trading post, they established Calcutta as a trading post. They were there under sufferance from the local rulers. They had to pay the taxes and the bribes and all this sort of stuff. It started at a time when England was not particularly successful on the world stage. And then in the 18th century, they went from being a bunch of traders with bodyguards to having the world's largest army and, ruling all of Bengal and subjugating the Mughal emperor and getting him to give a fig leaf of legitimacy to their so-called concession. Essentially, they ruled India, and then in later periods extended that to the parts south and west. I mean, it's just astounding that this was. It had a board of directors. They weren't reporting to the Prime Minister; they were reporting to a board of directors, and half of the Parliament owned shares, so they would just license it to do whatever the hell it want. They replaced replaced the local rulers, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. They were incredibly rapacious. This was a for-profit corporation, and all of the people there were just extracting as much wealth out of the local people as they could. And India was a fabulously wealthy country. I mean, this is one of the things that in India and China can never work out. Like what happened? God damn it! How did the West actually become dominant? Because India had this fabulous civilization and fabulous wealth, and got beaten up by this stupid corporation, and a similar thing happened to the Chinese, which they now see as a great humiliation. And so credit to William Dalrymple, it is well told as a story, and I think also today's not the day to do it, but it reflects also on some of the issues in this High Court decision, because it's about how did the British Empire manage legitimacy in the different countries that had finished up ruling. And there was one thing to settle a country like Australia and to claim various rights under international law, to settle a country like New Zealand and argue from a different basis in international law and conclude treaties. But in India, it was, as Dalrymple said, an anarchy, and it wasn't until the 19th century that the British came in and finally took over and asserted sovereignty and tried to put it on, anything like a proper legal basis. It's actually a remarkable book. I recommend it.
Oh, well, it sounds like the future for Amazon.
with its own armies.
Just armies of drones just overhead correcting your behaviour, directing you to buy things in boxes.
Yeah, I think there's been plenty.
Another picture of Andrew's internal monologue there.
There's plenty. Peter F. Hamilton, I think, has a future in which the corporations. There's basically 100 corporations which banded together to rule the universe.
Yeah, I think that was the premise for Demolition Man, the great Sylvester Stallone movie.
Yes, that is a good movie.
Yeah. There's only one restaurant, and it's called Taco Bell.
Yeah.
Take it away.
I'm conscious of the time. I'll just do this quickly because my choice, I really only wanted to make 2 points about it. It's called Sweet Smell of Success. It's a movie from 1957 by a guy named Alex McKendrick. And the point that I wanted to make was just, one, this is a very good movie. If you haven't heard of it, it's actually I came across it on Stan, looking for like an old. I was looking for, because they don't have categories, and I was like looking for old movies because, and this was the second point I wanted to make. This is a very good movie. The second point I wanted to make was that old movies are more important now than ever before, because movies, I think we've talked about this before, have become vehicles simply for delivering ideology. And it's very hard to suspend your disbelief. I actually find them less enjoyable when I'm being preached at. McKendrick was certainly no conservative. I think actually he ended up leaving Hollywood, spent the second half of his career teaching film. He was one of the pioneers in teaching film, and the inspiration for that sort of film school brat 1970s movement. So it's not like he was some sort of rabid conservative, and it's not like this movie is, right wing or whatever. But it's just an interesting little story told very well. It's about basically the only bit you have to suspend your disbelief on is that it's about a newspaper columnist who is so powerful he can make or break careers, which doesn't exist anymore. But anyway, he's this gossip columnist, and it's about a public relations guy who places stories with him. And basically the guy turns off access until this public relations guy, played by Tony Curtis, gets his sister to break up with this jazz musician. So he starts basically sending out scuttlebutt around this guy and basically trying to wreck this guy's life and try and manage this relationship with this overbearing, extremely powerful gossip columnist played by Burt Lancaster. And it's just got like a really good old-fashioned script full of like witticisms. And I just think it was really, the reason I wanted to recommend this to people was it was very refreshing to me to watch it compared to some of the more recent Hollywood output.
And proper wordplay. I think that was another thing that we were talking about on our conversation channel this week, was the witticisms, the ability with words as opposed to what
just dumbfounded reaction shots. Like, oh, that guy said something dumb.
Which is 90% of movies nowadays, I think was the point somebody was making. You have been listening to Looking Forward, which is a production of the Institute of Public Affairs. Don't forget to go to ipa.org.au to see how you can join or donate if you haven't already. If you're already a member, thank you so much for your support and letting us do what we do. Do go to our website to look at our latest research on the High Court decision and other things like that. I'd like to thank my panellists today, Chris Berg.
Thanks, Scott.
Dara Macdonald.
Thank you.
Andrew Bushnell.
Cheers.
And of course, Josh in the studio control room. Thanks as always for helping us put our show together. We'll be back with more looking forward next week.